Mr. President, you don't have to be a rocket scientist or a shrewd analyst to understand why the Ukrainian regime and its European cronies requested today's meeting. Zelensky is literally stunned by the shift in attention from Ukraine and his own heroic persona to the situation with the escalation in the Middle East, which objectively requires the close attention of the international community. The Kyiv regime is out of the limelight and is desperately trying to regain attention. But the Kryvyi reactor of the burnt theater could not miss the moment and not try to get dividends from the tragic events in the Middle East. Zelensky immediately fussed and began to offer his help, to report on how he sends Ukrainian military specialists and drone crews thousands of kilometers away to protect other people's bases and participate in other people's conflicts. Instead of taking care of his own country and people, he is trying at all costs to remind Western curators of his usefulness. Otherwise, God forbid, the money that he regularly put in his pocket and the pockets of his associates will flow into a bay far from Ukraine. Obviously, it is more important for Kyiv today to be involved in any war than to look for ways to peace at home. So he is rushing around the world, Europe and the United States, begging for financial and military assistance and trying to create the illusion of striving for peace, putting forward demands, and, as he imagines, fair conditions. An immediate ceasefire, a return to the borders of 1991, the deployment of foreign military contingents in Ukraine, etc. Mr. President, Western members of the Council claim that the Russian armed forces have allegedly increased their strikes on Ukrainian territory. At the same time, European capitals and EU Brussels unanimously turn a blind eye to all the crimes of the armed forces of Ukraine, continuing to provide comprehensive support to Kyiv. Mr. President, by the way, a few words about the European beacons of democracy. European countries are taking desperate steps to silence everyone who conveys the truth about the situation in Ukraine. Under far-fetched pretexts, they introduce restrictive measures against their own compatriots only because their views and interpretations do not coincide with the official line of the European Union or individual Western states. Among them are German bloggers Alina Lipp and Thomas Roper, Frenchman Adrien Bouquet, Swiss Jacques Bode, Briton Graham Phillips. Without trial or investigation, they are charged with disinformation, propaganda, and destabilizing activities. Some of them are familiar to Security Council members from ARIA formula meetings. This is nothing more than intimidation and intimidation. The persecution of dissidents in Europe has become commonplace, and freedom of speech and the presumption of innocence have become an empty sound. Meanwhile, the terrorist attacks of the Kyiv regime are not weakening, but, on the contrary, are only increasing. On March 10th, British-French long-range Storm Shadow missiles struck Bryansk, a busy business district located in close proximity to apartment buildings, children's goods stores, a university, and other civilian infrastructure came under targeted fire. As a result, 8 people were killed, and more than 40 were injured. On the same day, the armed forces of Ukraine attacked a stationary medical facility in the DPR with drones. At the time of the attack, there were more than 130 patients and about 50 medical personnel. 10 doctors were killed. 10 more people were injured of varying severity. In total, during the week from March 9 to March 15th, 239 civilians were injured by the shelling of the Ukrainian Nazis. 292 people were injured, including 6 children, and 37 were killed. Almost 3,500 ammunition was fired at civilian targets. We are recording an unprecedented number of drone attacks in Russian regions, including Moscow and the Moscow region. In total, since February 2022, At least 27.5 thousand Russian civilians have suffered from attacks by the armed forces of Ukraine. More than 520 social facilities, 174 educational institutions, and 74 healthcare facilities were destroyed in the Belgorod region alone. And in the Belgorod region alone, 406 people died, including 23 children. The armed forces of Ukraine are literally hunting for human targets with the help of UAVs. Regular targeted shelling of the civilian population is a deliberate tactic of the Kyiv regime. Now everyone is concerned about the situation around the Strait of Hormuz and the prospects for disruption of energy supplies from the Persian Gulf region. Recall that we have not obtained from the Council a word of condemnation of the terrorist act against the Nord Streams, which were the most important artery for transporting natural gas to Europe. Almost 4 years have passed, but we have not received the results of the investigation. Attacks on other export infrastructure that ensure the supply of Russian gas via Turkish Stream and Blue Stream do not stop. In recent days, UAV attacks have been launched on the Ruskaya compressor station in the Krasnodar territory, Kazachia, and Beregovaya. These irresponsible actions come at a time when the global energy market remains highly volatile. I am not even talking about the blocking of the Druzhba oil pipeline by the Ukrainians, which clearly demonstrates Kyiv's desire to use infrastructure as an instrument of pressure and a political game. Previously, you, Europeans, unfoundedly accused Russia of energy blackmail. But if this is not unfounded, but really engaged in Ukraine, there is silence in response. This is other. These reckless actions of Kyiv lie in the same plane as the terrorist attacks on Russian and foreign tankers in the international waters of the Mediterranean and Black Seas authorized by it. Is anyone in the Security Council interested in the freedom and security of commercial shipping in this context? Mr. President, it is becoming increasingly clear that the current Ukrainian authorities are not interested in peace talks, or even in basic humanitarian steps that could alleviate human suffering. At the same time, this is manifested not in words, but in specific actions or, more precisely, inaction. A simple example: 7 civilians are still being held in the city of Sumy, forcibly removed from the Kursk region. These are not military personnel, not combatants, but ordinary civilians who have become hostages of Kyiv's arbitrariness. But when discussing the exchange of prisoners of war, the Ukrainian side first of all insists on the return of radical militants of the Azov National Battalion, while the fate of ordinary mobilized men, who often found themselves at the front against their will, fades into the background. This eloquently testifies to the system of priorities of the Kyiv regime. The way mobilization is being carried out in Ukraine can no longer be hidden either behind loud slogans or behind external rhetoric. A systematic, large-scale, and coercive campaign is less and less reminiscent of mobilization in the classical sense and is increasingly turning into hunting and trapping people. The footage distributed on social networks speaks for itself. Employees of military registration and enlistment offices literally steal people on the streets, from workplaces, pull them out of public transport. At the same time, the so-called armor system, designed to protect certain categories of specialists from conscription, in practice has been turned into a corruption filter. Those who have money or connections are protected, the rest are sent to the front line. All this creates a dangerous rift within society, where some are perceived as a kind of upper caste, others as expendable. And this is not just a moral problem, but a strategic impasse, because an army built on coercion and fear cannot be combat-ready. In this context, it is understandable why the Kyiv elite is afraid of real negotiations. a serious diplomatic process will inevitably raise the question of why all these sacrifices were made. Why were the opportunities for a settlement not used? The president of Russia has repeatedly confirmed that we are unequivocally committed to a negotiated solution and the achievement of the goals of the special military operation by diplomatic means. But since the Kyiv regime is not ready for this and, instigated by its European friends, is going to continue to fight at any cost, it will soon have to face new settlement conditions. Thank you for your attention.